I tried to go further toward that brightness. I walked into a liquid surrounding the island of presence, and everything related to myself vanished. Yet I remained, not as a person but as the essence of life itself, fully conscious and whole. I merged, I suppose, with a collective presence. Welcome to Let's Lift the Veil. If you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell to join the community, exploring near-death stories and their life-changing lessons. What does it feel like to leave the body, cross into a radiant presence, and then be sent back with a message to live differently? This video presents the true account of a young woman's 1971 motorcycle accident and the extraordinary near-death sequence that followed. An out-of-body journey past the stars, a hallway of golden light, an overwhelming unity in a pool of collective being, and a reluctant return. Expect vivid detail, emotional nuance, and the practical ways that this experience reshaped a life. We have clear timestamps in the description, and a reflective My Life Behind the Veil segment at the end, that explains how the experience altered relationships, beliefs, and daily choices. Like the video if the theme resonates, and leave a first thought in the comments. A single sentence is perfect. It was Halloween, October 31st, 1971. I was a young woman riding pillion on a motorcycle, naive about the small but vital technique of leaning into a curve. We hit an oil slick. The bike suddenly leaned left, and everything changed in an instant. I remember being thrown into the air, the guardrail rushing up toward me, and then a complete blackout. A high-pitched, bell-like white noise filled the background of my awareness, and then, astonishingly, I was nowhere near my body. From that instant onward, I experienced what I can only call an undeniable out-of-body state. There was no fuzzy dream logic. My consciousness was lucid and steady. First I saw a thin crescent that I slowly realized was the backside of Earth. It grew smaller as I was drawn away, like a tractor beam in science fiction pulling me forward. Stars, nebulae, galaxies. Everything was alive and in 3 dimensions. The visual richness was overwhelming, but not in a chaotic way. It was precise, vivid, and full of motion. I knew profoundly and without doubt that this was real. I was drawn faster and faster until darkness swallowed the stars. Then, after a few leaps, a distant golden light appeared. It approached in stages, 8 to 10 jumps, and then I found myself at the edge of a boiling, sun-like golden cloud. The cloud was warm with an inner motion. It wasn't merely light, it was an almost liquid presence that pulsed with what I later had to call joy and peace. I entered it, and the experience shifted into what felt like a vast hallway, a 20 by 20 corridor made of that same radiant substance. People faded in and out of the edges of the cloud, and I floated over them on a level slightly above. They were serene, dressed in white, and looked content. At the end of that corridor I met a man behind a desk, the kind of figure you might mistake for a concierge, who looked up with a puzzled, almost exasperated expression. I don't know why I call him Howard except that it felt right in the moment. The name stuck with me. Behind him, beyond the desk, was an astonishing landscape. A hillside strewn with sparkling trees, flowers, a gentle brook, and people sitting in contemplative postures while a great light pulsed on them. While the clerk checked something, with a mechanical or computational task in his hands, I slipped around him to investigate. That's when I stepped into the central presence. A vast field of pure, pulsing love and innocence. When that presence flooded through me, it felt like being utterly cleansed, and returned to what I now understand as the core of my essence. In the most profound sense, my personal identity dissolved there. I stepped into a pool of what I could only call collective being. I knew every other life that was part of it. There was no fear, only an overwhelming sense of belonging and a completeness like stepping out of a shower, familiar, clean, and essential. I understood things in a new register. The big existential question, "Why are we here?" resolved itself into a simple, irreverent answer. Why not? Or simply because it was clarity without the need for doctrine. I felt unity with everything. The concept of a singular anthropomorphic God as I had been taught no longer resonated. I tried to go further toward that brightness. I walked into a liquid surrounding the island of presence, and everything related to myself vanished. Yet I remained, not as a person but as the essence of life itself, fully conscious and whole. I merged, I suppose, with a collective presence. My personal identity disappeared, but my essence continued to exist. However, this wasn't frightening at all. Instead, it felt like I was truly myself. What happened was that I became part of, or returned to the presence that was so amazing. The closest analogy I can come up with is Odo in Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, when he would go to his home planet and return to the collective. Only everything in the universe is part of this collective. In essence, the universe is the collective. It's rather difficult to explain because it's outside the realm of human experience. When I lost my identity, I became aware of all other lives. And then, quite suddenly, I was being repelled. The clerk had pulled me back to the front of the desk, and with a tone equal parts dismissive and measured, he told me not to worry. He made it clear, it wasn't my time, I had to return. I was pushed away from the cloud, retraced the rapid, breathless path home past the heaven-like vistas. When I got back to the earth, all went black again. Then I was hovering up in the air where airplanes fly. I looked down and saw a curvy road below me with some kind of activity going on. I descended in stages, much like what happened when I encountered the gold cloud. My first thought was, hey, there's a wreck down there. When I got closer, it was, hey, that girl has on the same clothes I have. It wasn't until I was about 25 feet above when I thought, hey, that's me. Everything went black, and I heard someone screaming at the top of her lungs, far away again, and I re-entered my earthly body. Coming back into my body was disorienting and painful. I opened my eyes to darkness and screaming. I was lying on my stomach with someone sitting on my back, a doctor's wife from across the street, who had pinned me to prevent spinal movement. I tried a small test, I moved my fingers. And she told me that if I had broken my neck, I likely wouldn't be able to do that. That realization, that I had been outside my body and returned even when doctors pronounced me clinically unstable, hammered home the reality of the whole event. At the hospital, my blood pressure reportedly dropped to 0 and physicians said they were losing me. Yet I knew differently. I had been elsewhere, I had come back. Emotionally, the experience was both ecstatic and wrenching. Crossing into that light gave me a sensation of ineffable joy and absolute peace. Being pulled back produced real sorrow and a sense of having been refused. When the clerk, Howard, told me I had to return, I felt heartbreak. Afterward, telling the story was difficult. Some people believed me, many did not. The reactions were especially sharp from those who claimed strict Christian beliefs. I was dismissed, accused, even told I was in hell by someone. Those reactions stung, but they also clarified something vital for me. The language and metaphors people use about the afterlife often miss the phenomenological truth I had encountered. Intellectually and spiritually, the experience transformed my worldview. I had been raised Protestant, but after the event the old theological categories felt inadequate. I stopped seeing God in strictly anthropomorphic terms. Instead, I experienced a felt knowledge of unity, that everything participates in a shared existence, that the separations between beings are in some profound sense a functional illusion. The traditional big guy on the throne model felt like a children's story. The Trinity and dogmatic answers no longer captured the presence I'd encountered. I became, in practical terms, unaffiliated and more agnostic about the personified God, while profoundly certain that something real, loving, and collective existed. Practically, my life changed in big ways, though not always in ways that were visible to everyone. I noticed synchronicities that I eventually learned to interpret as signs of Howard's attention. When I asked for help internally, a solution or event would often materialize about a week later. These were not dramatic miracles in every case, but quirky, consequential shifts. A job opening where there were none, a relationship aligning after a period of struggle. I married eventually after 2 failed marriages. Interestingly, the partner I had asked for seemed to arrive about a week after I had talked to Howard about readiness to meet someone. I do not claim supernatural powers or psychic gifts after the NDE. I do claim an altered orientation toward life, less fear of death, increased curiosity, and a stronger sense that meaning is something I choose and enact, rather than receive from a fixed destiny. In the end, the experience remains the clearest memory of my life. I remember Howard, the golden cloud, the pool of collective being, and the aching, stubborn desire to return to that presence. I also remember the imperative phrase I heard in the distance as I was being repelled. "Don't worry." I have interpreted that as permission to embrace life here, to treat earthly existence as a gift rather than a prison. That changed everything. My life, behind the veil. What this incident really changed. After the NDE, my life was not marked by permanent miracles or revelations that could easily be put down on paper. It was profoundly reshaped, step by step. I lost the old image of a personal God as I had learned it. I gained a lived experience of universal interconnectedness. This led to concrete changes: a decrease in fear of death, an affirmation of personal responsibility for creating meaning, and a spiritual curiosity that does not bow to any doctrine. I became more resilient in the face of suffering and more open to the beauty of everyday life. Spiritually, I no longer place my faith in ritualized dogma. I place it in practice. The felt experience of oneness, the simple habit of asking for help and noticing when the world answers. I call that presence Howard, partly in jest, and partly because a name anchored the relational aspect of what I encountered. He functions for me like a guide or caseworker. I ask, I observe, and sometimes an apparent alignment happens days later. These changes shape decisions, how I choose relationships, jobs, and how I orient my values. I do not believe I acquired clairvoyant powers, but I did acquire a more subtle attunement to synchronicities and an inner assurance that the universe is not hostile. Relationally, my outward social ties did not immediately change in the way others expected. Some friends and family remained distant or skeptical. The social cost was real. People called me crazy, some accused me of drug use, and a few religious interlocutors were actively hostile. Over time, though, I learned to be selective in sharing. I stopped repeating the story to anyone indifferent or closed. Instead, I found pockets of people who listened, and those relationships deepened. Professionally, I experienced fortuitous openings. A job in the early 1980s that happened under odd circumstances, the arrival of a life partner after I had asked internally for readiness, events that reinforced my trust in the subtle guidance I felt. Finally, and this is important for anyone listening, the main practical outcome is not dogma or spectacle, but an existential reorientation. Less fear, more agency, and a willingness to choose meaning deliberately. If you ask whether my life became easy, the answer is no. Life retained its challenges, but how I approached those challenges changed. "Don't worry," Howard said as I was pushed away. That injunction became a programmatic injunction for living. Accept this life as a gift. Invest in it, create meaning, be kind. That is the ongoing work behind the veil. If this story struck a chord, consider subscribing and enabling notifications to follow future episodes in the Behind the Veil series. Thank you for listening to this testimony of crossing and returning, an account that blends awe, sorrow, and profound reorientation. If this episode moved you, share the video with someone who needs a different perspective on life and death. Check the description for links to sources, timestamps, and other testimonies. For more deep dives, click the playlist linked on screen. See you in the next episode. Keep an open heart and a curious mind. Please take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you soon for another journey beyond the veil.